You have a picture in your head of the night before the execution of Jesus of Nazareth, and I can tell you with absolute stratigraphic and historical certainty that your picture is completely wrong. You are picturing a vast and airy dining hall with high ceilings, perhaps with classical stone columns or stained glass windows, depending entirely on which century of European religious art has colonized your historical imagination. You are picturing a long rectangular wooden table, meticulously draped in a pristine white linen cloth, with 13 men sitting upright on wooden chairs or heavy benches, all conveniently arranged on one side of the table, so they can face the viewer like actors positioned on a theatrical stage. You are picturing individual ceramic plates, jeweled metal chalices, and a serene, solemn atmosphere of quiet, dignified contemplation. You are picturing the famous mural painted by Leonardo da Vinci in Milan, or one of the tens of thousands of cheap, sanitized imitations that have hung on the walls of Sunday school classrooms and church basements for the last 5 centuries. And the reason I am speaking to you today is to tell you that practically every single element of that image is a verifiable historical impossibility. History isn't what they told you, it's what they hid. We have wasted decades on a romanticized lie because the reality of the first century material record was considered too ugly, too Jewish, too impoverished, and too uncomfortable for the institutional gatekeepers of Western civilization. My name is Arthur Harrison. I have spent the last 60 years of my life with my hands deep in the dirt of the Levant, excavating the actual limestone blocks, the actual shattered pottery, and the actual domestic architecture of the ancient Near East. I have overseen extensive archaeological digs from the crowded lower city of Jerusalem to the arid, sun-baked plains of Iraq, and I can tell you from a lifetime of primary field experience that the evidence doesn't care about your religious tradition. When we strip away the medieval mythology and look strictly at the archaeological data from early 1st century Judea, when we painstakingly examine the Herodian period domestic structures, and when we read the primary textual sources in their original Koine Greek and Aramaic without the heavy theological filtering of later institutional translators, a completely different and far more dangerous picture emerges. Tonight, we are going to tear down the Milanese dining hall that Da Vinci painted, and we are going to dismantle the Gothic tourist trap that currently stands on Mount Zion. We are going to rebuild the upper room exactly as the archaeological and textual record dictates, stone by rough-hewn stone, until you are forced to see the raw, crowded, suffocating, and deeply paranoid reality of what actually happened in the spring of the year 33. The conventional narrative of the Last Supper did not materialize out of thin air. It was meticulously constructed and deliberately reinforced over centuries to serve highly specific institutional and theological needs. By the time Christianity became the officially sanctioned religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the institutional church urgently required a visual language of imperial grandeur. The modest, radical, and politically subversive origins of a crucified Galilean peasant and his illiterate working-class followers were a massive public relations liability for an institution that was now operating out of massive basilicas, palatial estates, and the halls of imperial power in Rome and Constantinople. The Eucharist was no longer a dangerous, clandestine memorial meal shared in the dark back rooms of mud brick houses in the Levant. It had become the central, highly formalized liturgy of an imperial cult. Therefore, the architectural setting of the original event had to be retroactively upgraded to match the current status of the church. The humble domestic room had to become a palace. The terrified Galilean participants had to become dignified, stoic clerics. And the low floor table had to become an elevated, sacrificial altar. This relentless process of architectural gentrification reached its absolute climax during the Crusader period in the Levant. If you travel to Jerusalem today and pay a commercial tour guide to take you to the Cenacle, the officially recognized traditional site of the upper room on what is now erroneously called Mount Zion, you will be escorted into a beautiful, sweeping, vaulted room with pointed Gothic arches and elegant stone pillars. Millions of faithful pilgrims have stood in that room and wept. The fundamental problem, which the archaeological community has documented extensively, is that the room was built by European crusaders in the 12th century, more than a full millennium after the events it supposedly commemorates. The masonry is distinctly crusader. The architectural vocabulary is entirely European. The geography itself is a pious fiction, established primarily because it was highly convenient for Byzantine and medieval pilgrimage routes to cluster all the major biblical tourist sites as closely together as possible within a safe, easily defensible perimeter. The institutional church has known this archaeological reality for more than a century, yet religious authorities continue to sanction and promote the site because it perfectly serves the romanticized narrative, and frankly, because the pilgrimage economy generates an astronomical amount of revenue. The historical truth is much less photogenic and far less profitable. To understand what the room actually looked like, we have to bypass the tourist sites entirely and rely exclusively on the hard material evidence excavated directly from the domestic quarters of first-century Jerusalem. Following the 1967 war, my colleague Naaman Avigad led extensive, groundbreaking, and heavily scrutinized excavations in what is today the Jewish quarter of the Old City, finally uncovering the undisturbed residential areas of the Herodian Upper City that had been buried since the Roman destruction in the year 70. These massive excavations, along with subsequent stratigraphic analyses of the poorer Lower City and the steep slopes of the Tyropoion Valley, finally gave the academic community a comprehensive empirical understanding of how normal people actually lived, built, and ate in the city during the early Roman period. We found the sprawling palatial mansion of the priestly elites. We found the burnt house belonging to the Cathras family. And most importantly, we found numerous smaller, densely packed domestic complexes. We measured the exact dimensions of their living spaces, we documented the structural thickness of their walls, we chemically analyzed the composition of their mortar, and we cataloged the specific typologies of their everyday domestic pottery and cooking wares. The absolute archaeological consensus, based on tens of thousands of individual data points extracted from these Jerusalem excavations, demonstrates unequivocally that standard domestic architecture for non-elites in this period was characterized by thick walls of roughly hewn local limestone blocks, bonded together not with elegant Roman cement, but with simple mud mortar, and covered with a cheap, uneven layer of gray lime plaster. The ceilings were extremely low, constructed of rough wooden beams overlaid with smaller branches, packed earth, and thick clay designed to keep out the heavy winter rains and to trap whatever heat was available. The rooms were small, poorly ventilated, perpetually dark, and strictly utilitarian. Even the wealthiest, most powerful priestly families in the Upper City lived in spaces that would feel incredibly cramped and claustrophobic by modern Western standards. For an itinerant, controversial rabbi and a dozen rural fishermen traveling down from the Galilee, the accommodations would have been significantly more impoverished. They most likely rented a simple, temporary secondary room built directly onto the flat roof of a crowded courtyard house in the poorest sections of the Lower City, accessed only by a narrow exterior stone staircase. Beyond the raw architecture of the walls and roof, the material record provides us with the precise, tangible physical objects that would have necessarily populated that specific room. In the early 1st century, Judea experienced a massive, unprecedented explosion in the domestic production and daily use of chalkstone vessels. Unlike standard fired clay pottery, which under strict Jewish ritual law contracted impurity and had to be physically smashed to pieces if it ever became ritually defiled, stone was considered naturally impervious to ritual impurity according to the rabbinic traditions that were solidifying at the time. The extensive archaeological excavations at a major quarry and manufacturing workshop near the village of Hizma, located just a few miles north of Jerusalem, revealed an industrial-scale production of these specific stone cups, large bowls, and standardized measuring jugs. The overwhelming presence of these chalkstone vessels in almost every single domestic excavation layer from the period tells us exactly what the inhabitants of Jerusalem, including Jesus and his followers, were drinking from during religious festivals. They were not drinking from ornate, jewel-encrusted metal chalices. They were drinking from soft, mass-produced, hand-carved, grayish-white limestone cups that literally felt powdery and chalky to the touch. The reason you have never heard a single sermon about the chalky limestone cups or the crumbling mud mortar or the suffocatingly low wattle and daub ceilings is because of a deeply entrenched, highly coordinated pattern of institutional suppression that I have spent my entire professional career fighting against. I call them my wasted decades. Throughout the 1970s and well into the 1980s, as these undeniable archaeological realities were literally being unearthed and cataloged, there was a concerted, deliberate effort by both elite academic institutions and massive religious organizations to keep the findings firmly out of the popular consciousness. Funding for archaeological publication, which is astronomically expensive, was frequently tied directly to institutions that relied heavily on the traditional, romanticized biblical narratives to maintain their wealthy donor bases. If you submitted a rigorous academic monograph demonstrating with stratigraphic proof that the sacred geography of Jerusalem was a late medieval fabrication, or that the physical realities of the Gospels blatantly contradicted the liturgical traditions of the modern church, your publication was intentionally delayed, subjected to endless hostile reviews by theologians masquerading as historians, or simply buried in an obscure, impossibly expensive journal that no one outside of a locked university basement would ever read. This systemic suppression extended far beyond the physical archaeology and reached deep into the textual, linguistic, and manuscript record. My late wife, Eleanor, was one of the finest, most uncompromising scholars of Koine Greek and ancient Near Eastern linguistics I have ever had the privilege to know. She spent years of her life meticulously documenting how translation committees, operating under the strict oversight of religious authorities and denominational boards, deliberately and consistently altered the English meaning of specific Greek verbs in the New Testament manuscripts to protect the visual theology of the Last Supper. The earliest gospel texts repeatedly and exclusively used the Greek verbs anakemai and anapipto to describe exactly what Jesus and the disciples were doing physically at the meal. These words do not mean to sit. They have never meant to sit in any secular or religious Greek text of the period. They specifically, medically, and unambiguously mean to recline, to lie down horizontally, or to lean back. Yet, from Jerome's Latin Vulgate to the politically commissioned King James Version, and straight through to almost every modern English translation sold today, these specific verbs were consistently and falsely rendered as sitting. They did this because the institutional church absolutely needed the congregation to picture ordained priests sitting solemnly at an elevated altar, not a group of impoverished Jewish peasants lying in the dirt on the floor. It is past time to look squarely at the uncensored evidence and rebuild the room as it actually existed, starting with the complete eradication of the table. There was no long rectangular dining table in that room. The very concept of the long, elevated dining table where people sit on one side simply did not exist in the domestic culture of first-century Judea, nor anywhere in the broader Roman Mediterranean for that matter. The absolute prevailing custom for formal meals, particularly celebratory, highly structured festival meals like the Passover Seder, was the triclinium. The triclinium was a specific architectural and furniture arrangement consisting of low, floor-level tables formed into a tight U shape. The guests did not sit on chairs. Chairs were exceedingly rare luxury items, reserved strictly for imperial magistrates, judges, or absolute elite status individuals in highly formal civic settings. For a standard meal, and especially a banquet, the participants reclined completely on the floor, resting their bodies on thin woven cushions or cheap straw mats spread directly over the packed earth or rough stone paving of the room. The physical, anatomical mechanics of reclining at a floor-level triclinium dictate the entire spatial choreography of the meal, and this is exactly where the conventional narrative falls apart completely under historical scrutiny. When you recline at a low table, You are required to lie horizontally on your left side, supporting the weight of your upper torso with your left elbow resting firmly on a cushion. This specific posture is necessary because it leaves your right hand completely free to reach forward and take food from the low communal table. Because every single participant is reclining on their left side, arranged sequentially around the U-shaped configuration. Each person's head is positioned in incredibly close proximity to the chest or the back of the person reclining immediately to their left. The legs of the diners are stretched out diagonally away from the table, often overlapping behind the person next to them. This is not a matter of avant-garde academic interpretation. This is the heavily documented, physically necessary anatomical reality of Roman and Judean dining customs in the early 1st century, confirmed by thousands of secular textual sources, floor mosaics, and the physical dimensions of excavated dining spaces throughout the entire Mediterranean basin. Once you truly understand the physical horizontal posture of the triclinium, the seemingly mysterious textual descriptions of the Last Supper suddenly lose their spiritualized ambiguity and become starkly, almost aggressively practical. In the manuscript tradition of the Gospel of John, there is a famous, highly debated detail where the anonymous beloved disciple is described as leaning on Jesus' breast or reclining closely next to him. In the Da Vinci painting and in centuries of religious art, this is depicted as a physically awkward, almost affectionate leaning over sideways while sitting upright in heavy wooden chairs, which makes absolutely no sense anatomically or socially. But if they are reclining on the floor at a triclinium, the spatial dynamics change completely. The disciple positioned immediately to the right of Jesus in the U-shape would naturally and unavoidably have his head positioned right at chest level with Jesus. If that disciple simply leaned back to ask a hushed question or hear a whisper, the back of his head would literally rest heavily against Jesus' chest. It is a precise throwaway detail that conclusively proves the historical memory embedded in the original text reflects the gritty material reality of a floor-level triclinium, completely refuting the Renaissance dining hall myth. The exact same physical reality explains the famous moment of the dipping of the bread. The text specifically described Jesus identifying his betrayer as the one who dips his hand into the bowl with him at the exact same time. At a long rectangular table with 13 men seated in chairs, sharing a single communal bowl is logistically and physically impossible. People seated at the far ends of the table would have to stand up, walk behind the others, and reach over to dip their bread. But at a triclinium, the low table is quite narrow, and a single shallow communal bowl of bitter herbs or thick stewed fruit is placed squarely in the center of the U-shape. The participants, reclining in extremely close physical proximity, all reach forward into the same central bowl with their right hands. The physical proximity required for Jesus and Judas to reach into the bowl at the exact same moment without awkward stretching indicates that Judas was reclining immediately adjacent to Jesus, most likely in the highly specific position of honor located immediately to his left, while John was in the secondary position to his right. The psychological tension of that specific moment is infinitely more visceral and terrifying when you realize they are physically lying mere inches apart on the dirt floor, breathing the exact same stagnant air, sharing the same bowl while discussing betrayal. Let us briefly examine the lighting and the sensory atmosphere of the room. It was the evening of the Passover, and the text clearly indicated it had already grown dark outside. The room would not have been illuminated by the bright, clean, burning wax candles you see in European paintings. It would have been lit exclusively by small, mass-produced, wheel-made clay oil lamps, a specific archaeological typology known to us in the field as Herodian pinched lamps. These were incredibly basic items. They were small, shallow clay saucers with a manually pinched spout, holding only a few ounces of unrefined, low-quality olive oil and a cheap flax wick. They put out a very dim, flickering, unstable yellowish light and generated a highly significant amount of oily, suffocating black smoke. I want you to actively imagine a dozen of these cheap clay lamps sputtering and smoking in a very low-ceilinged room with absolutely no cross-ventilation, shared by 13 unwashed adult men who have been walking the dusty, manure-covered roads of Judea in leather sandals. The air in that room would have been incredibly thick and heavy with the smell of burning olive oil, human sweat, roasted lamb meat, and the harsh, metallic, highly oxidized scent of the cheap, poorly fermented wine favored by the lower classes, which was likely diluted with unfiltered well water in a large clay crater sitting in the corner of the dirt floor. The major archaeological discoveries that eventually forced the reluctant academic establishment to quietly acknowledge these harsh realities were not made easily, and their publication was fiercely and persistently resisted by the old guard. When the excavations of the Jewish quarter conclusively revealed the vast, undeniable disparity between the sprawling wealth of the Herodian priestly elite and the desperate squalor of the common people, it became intellectually impossible to maintain the comforting illusion that a controversial Galilean rabbi would have had access to a palatial, columned dining hall for a private meal. Furthermore, the earlier discovery of the massive communal dining facilities at Khirbet Qumran, located near the arid shores of the Dead Sea, provided a stark, undeniable comparative model for exactly how strict sectarian Jewish groups organized their ritual meals in this exact historical period. The extensive Qumran evidence showed rigid hierarchical seating directly on the floor, the exclusive use of basic, locally manufactured pottery, and a complete, absolute absence of the Greco-Roman architectural grandeur that the later imperial church had falsely projected onto the Last Supper. The defensive institutional scholars tried desperately for decades to argue that Qumran was an isolated anomaly, a weird desert fringe group with no bearing on Jerusalem, but the subsequent domestic excavations in the city limits confirmed definitively that floor seating and low tables were the absolute universal standard for non-elite Judeans. Even more devastating to the conventional sanitized narrative was the recent, highly controversial archaeological assessment of the traditional Mount Zion site itself. When advanced ground-penetrating radar and highly limited, heavily monitored soundings were finally permitted in the immediate vicinity of the Crusader cenacle, the data revealed exactly what we suspected. They revealed that the Crusader structure was built directly on top of the massive foundations of a 4th century Byzantine basilica called Hagia Sion. And when we looked beneath the Byzantine basilica, there was absolutely nothing there that credibly connected to a 1st century domestic structure matching the biblical description of the upper room. The entire geographical tradition was a later imperial invention, a massive, expensive architectural performance designed specifically to give wealthy Byzantine pilgrims a comfortable, impressive place to pray, entirely disconnected from the raw stratigraphic reality of the events of the year 33. The religious institutions kept this data as quiet as possible because the historical truth severely disrupted the lucrative economy of pilgrimage and threatened the foundational theology of the elevated altar. So let us finally assemble the recalibrated, rigorously historical reconstruction of that night, based strictly and unapologetically on the surviving material record. The upper room was a katalema, a simple, poorly constructed guest room built onto the flat utilitarian roof of a modest courtyard house. It was most likely located in the crowded, impoverished lower city on the steep eastern slope of the Tyropoion Valley, exactly where the poorer permanent residents and the massive influx of rural visiting pilgrims clustered during the festivals. The walls were rough, unpolished limestone coated in cheap, flaking gray lime plaster, heavily stained with black soot from generations of oil lamps. The ceiling was oppressively low, made of sagging wooden beams and packed earth, physically pressing down on the occupants and aggressively trapping the sweltering heat of the Middle Eastern spring. There were no wooden chairs anywhere in the building. There was no long rectangular table. There were simply 13 exhausted men lying horizontally on their left sides on thin, woven straw mats directly on the floor, arranged in a tight claustrophobic U-shape around a low, crude wooden or stone structure. The atmosphere in that room was not serene, it was not peaceful, and it was certainly not contemplative. It was suffocatingly, dangerously tense. Jerusalem during the week of Passover was a political and military powder keg waiting for a spark. The normal population of perhaps 40 to 80,000 people suddenly swelled to several 100,000 religious pilgrims. The ruthless Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, had specifically brought extra cohorts of heavily armed, highly aggressive auxiliary troops down from the coastal capital of Caesarea Maritima. He stationed them prominently in the Antonia fortress, looming directly over the temple courts, ready to brutally crush any hint of nationalist rebellion or messianic uprising. The air in the entire city was thick with the continuous smoke of thousands of sacrificial fires, and the narrow, winding dirt streets were packed tight with religious zealots, nervous Roman soldiers, and terrified locals. Inside that cramped, smoky upper room, Jesus and his closest disciples were keenly, terrifyingly aware that they were marked men targeted by both the temple authorities and the Roman state. The meal was rushed and highly anxious. The bread was flat, tough, and unleavened, torn apart violently with dirty, bare hands, not sliced delicately on a polished silver platter. They drank their diluted wine from common, chalky stone cups. The conversation was terse, laced with paranoia, and heavily shadowed by the absolute certainty of impending state violence. When you forcefully replace the elegant Milanese dining hall with the dirty, soot-stained floor of a Judean guest room, you are completely forced to confront the massive theological implications for contemporary understanding. We collectively traded a raw, dangerous, and politically explosive historical reality for a safe, static, and highly sanitized painting because reality is profoundly uncomfortable. A Jesus who sits elevated on a high chair at the exact center of a palatial hall, separated from the viewer by a pristine table, is essentially a Roman emperor holding court. A Jesus who lies down in the dirt with illiterate fishermen, hiding out from the military police in a smoky, claustrophobic room that smells of sweat and fear, is a dangerous political revolutionary. The institution spent centuries deliberately elevating the architecture of the room because they desperately wanted to elevate their own unquestionable authority. They needed you to look in awe at the gold chalices, the marble columns, and the pristine linen so you would not look too closely at the dirt, the poverty, and the blood. They built an entire towering theological aesthetic on a foundation of pure architectural fiction. And when the archaeological shovels finally hit the dirt and proved them definitively wrong, they simply chose to protect the fiction. I am telling you to look at the stone, not the sermon. You now know, based on empirical evidence, that the biggest myth of Holy Thursday is the architecture of the room itself. You know for a fact that the table was a low triclinium, the seating was the dirt floor, the drinking cups were carved stone, and the air was thick with soot and the terrifying threat of imminent execution. You know that the serene, dignified picture they sold you in Sunday school was essentially a medieval propaganda poster, designed specifically to turn a radical, terrifying final meal into a safe, dignified, and highly controllable imperial liturgy. I want you to think of someone you know right now who still genuinely believes that Leonardo da Vinci painted a historical photograph instead of a theological fantasy. Think of someone who honestly assumes that the polished traditions of the institution are identical to the gritty realities of the ancient past. Send this video directly to them. Force them to actually confront the material record and the stratigraphic data. And if you have the intellectual stomach to keep tearing down the romanticized lies and replacing them with the raw, uncensored evidence of history, subscribe to this channel. The wasted decades of suppression are over. We are going to put the historical record right, one stone at a time.